Waxman on the BP oil settlement, live here on C-SPAN.
Today, BP reached an agreement with the Justice Department to resolve all criminal claims against it by the United States government regarding the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, and to pay $4 billion in criminal penalties for these very serious violations of law. BP has pled guilty to 11 felony counts related to the tragic deaths of 11 men who were working on the Deepwater Horizon rig. The company also has pled guilty to criminal violations of the Clean Water Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And finally, BP has pled guilty to obstruction of Congress for lying to me, for lying to Henry Waxman and the other members of Congress about the amount of oil that was flowing out of the well. BP lied to me, they lied to the people of the Gulf, and they lied to their shareholders, and they lied to all Americans. There should be no more argument. BP is guilty of negligent and grossly negligent conduct that resulted in 11 deaths. BP is guilty of actions that harm the water and the wildlife of the Gulf of Mexico. And BP is guilty of lying to the Congress about what they had done and what they knew. In today's plea agreement, BP has admitted that former BP executive David Rainey lied to me and to the other members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. Mr. Rainey testified at a May 4, 2010 closed-door subcommittee briefing on the BP spill. He apparently was responsible for other information subsequently provided to the subcommittee about the size of the spill. According to the plea agreement, and I quote, "As part of its plea agreement, BP has admitted that, through Rainey, it withheld documents and provided false and misleading information in response to the United States House of Representatives' request for flow rate information. Among other things, BP admitted that Rainey manipulated internal estimates to understate the amount of oil flowing from the well and withheld data that contradicted BP's public estimate of 5,000 barrels of oil per day. BP has also admitted that, at the same time Rainey was preparing his manipulated estimates, BP's internal engineering response teams were using sophisticated methods that generated significantly higher estimates. The flow rate technical group, consisting of government and independent scientists, later concluded that more than 60,000 barrels per day were leaking into the Gulf during the relevant time, contrary to BP's representations to Congress," unquote. At the time that BP was providing Congress with a lowball estimate that the flow rate was 5,000 barrels per day, the company apparently had internal information that contradicted that estimate. They knew it could be many multiples greater than that, and it turned out to be wrong by at least a factor of 10. These higher estimates were not provided to the Congress, nor did BP ever correct the misleading information that they withheld from the subcommittee. In the course of their investigation into BP's misdeeds, the FBI and the Justice Department uncovered internal documents that apparently made it clear that Mr. Rainey and his colleagues knew that the likely flow rate was significantly higher than what Congress had been told. Today, I am making public a copy of the documents which I provided to the Justice Department in response to their request for information regarding our BP investigation. At the time that the disaster was occurring, I said that I thought that BP was either lying about the flow rate or that they were incompetent. Today, we have confirmation that BP was both incompetent and that it was lying to the Congress. Today, the company is taking the first step towards making restitution for its misdeeds by pleading guilty to its criminal misconduct regarding the Deepwater Horizon disaster. I want to commend Attorney General Holder and the FBI for their excellent work in bringing the U.S. government's criminal case to a successful resolution. I would urge BP to expeditiously resolve the remaining civil complaints against it, including dropping their misguided attempt to contest the amount of oil that they are responsible for spilling into the Gulf of Mexico. Regarding allocation of the penalties, the portion of today's settlement directing significant funding for preservation and conservation of natural resources along the Gulf Coast is a significant step forward in repairing the unprecedented environmental harm caused by the BP spill. Revenue from future civil penalties will go to the Gulf states directly, but dedicating these criminal penalties to conservation efforts by the nonprofit Fish and Wildlife Foundation and scientific research conducted by the National Academy of Sciences is a critical step in healing our Gulf Coast. 11 Americans died, then BP lied, and then they tried to cover it up. They deserve this record-breaking penalty. Now let me turn and recognize Chairman Waxman.
Thank you, Ed Markey. This Justice Department announcement today is the largest criminal resolution in the U.S. history against BP for its role in the 20-ton Deepwater Horizon oil explosion and the subsequent spill. BP pled guilty as a company to a number of criminal charges: 11 counts of felony manslaughter, 1 count of obstruction of justice, 11 felony manslaughter counts, and 1 count of obstruction of Congress, which we take very seriously as members of Congress. Violations of the Clean Water Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the company is going to pay $4 billion in fines and penalties. In addition, 2 BP supervisors on board the Deepwater Horizon the day of the explosion, Robert Kaluza and David Vidrine, were each charged with 11 felony counts of seaman's manslaughter, 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter, and 1 violation of the Clean Water Act. In the 111th Congress, I was chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Our committee worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind what happened at the Deepwater Horizon the night of April 20th, 2010. Our investigation revealed that BP and other companies involved in drilling the Macondo well made a series of key decisions that led to this horrible incident. We learned that BP made choices about how to drill and finish the well that significantly increased the chances of a blowout. These decisions were all made to save money and time with little regard for safety. The company put profits ahead of safety, and the results were catastrophic. The blowout was preventable. It happened because BP made a series of reckless decisions. Now, at least, there is a measure of accountability. The Department of Justice has acted aggressively against BP. It's holding the company and key individuals criminally responsible. It's important to remember that this settlement does not end the process. In February of 2013, a jury will determine the civil liability that BP will face under the Clean Water Act and the Oil Pollution Act. And I'm hopeful that the other companies who played a role in this disaster, such as Transocean and Halliburton, will also face appropriate penalties for their actions. BP's actions caused the death of 11 men, caused one of the largest ecological disasters our country has ever faced. We will have the decision about the civil penalties, but there'll be further actions of criminal nature against some of the individuals who have been cited in the information filed by the Justice Department. We have not yet recovered from this disaster, and the families of those who lost their loved ones will never recover. But this is an important step in making sure that BP is held responsible for its action. I want to commend the work of Chairman Ed Markey. He pursued aggressively the statements that were made in the briefings that we received, in the hearings, as well as in other private meetings with representatives from BP. And when he heard that the amount that they were talking about discharging into the Gulf was as slow as it was being presented, he knew right away that it was inaccurate. And through the work that he did on this issue, he was able to give the Justice Department documents that led them to come to the very same conclusion. We need to hold wrongdoers accountable. I'm pleased that the Justice Department, and I commend the Attorney General, are taking the action to hold BP criminally accountable. They are yet to be held civilly accountable, along with the other companies who had a role to play in this disaster, and the individuals who gave misinformation to Congress or were on board the ship at the night of the explosion are going to have to answer for criminal charges as well. Thank you very much.
Questions from anyone?
Dr. Markey? I mean, you seem to take this very personally, the fact that you were lied to. I mean, do you?
At the point at which Chairman Waxman, I was the chairman of the subcommittee, Henry was the chairman of the full committee. We had an emergency briefing on May 4th asking BP to give us accurate information with regard to the flow rate into the Gulf. The answer to that question, to a very large extent, determined what the response would be on an emergency basis to deal with the impact of the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the harm that it would do to the ocean, the harm that it would do to sea life, the harm that it would do to the employment of all of those who live in the Gulf of Mexico. It is now clear that BP was lying to the Congress. They were deliberately lowballing the number because their liability is directly tied to the number of barrels of oil that flow into the ocean. If they're guilty of ordinary negligence, they would be charged with $1,100 per barrel. At 5,000 barrels per day, that's a far smaller fine than 50 or 60,000 barrels per day. If they're guilty of gross negligence, the penalty is $4,300 per barrel. So the range for the fine now can go from $5 billion to $21 billion. So the motive for the lie is very clear: to minimize the overall impact on BP and the other companies in terms of their liability if, in fact, that number was the higher number, which it turns out to have been. So I personally take it as an insult to Congress, but more importantly to the American people, because that's who we represent on a daily basis. We're tasked with getting the answers for the American people. And when you're lying to Congress, when you're lying to the Energy and Commerce Committee, you are actually lying to all of those people who are now going to bear the pain of the harm which is being done in the Gulf State region.
Thinking back to the time, did you know at the time, did you have suspicions at the time that lies were being told? And what sort of did you know? If so, what sort of did you know?
Yes. We had experts who were telling us that they felt that the flow rate was much higher. We had experts who arrived who said that that if they could gain access to the spill cam, that they would be able to determine how large that flow rate was, and we insisted upon the flow rate being made more clear by BP giving us access to all of the different angles that the cameras made it possible to observe the spill. And once that happened, the experts around the country who now had access to that information dramatically increased what was thought to be then the damage which was being done, because it was an exponentially higher spill rate than they had represented to us back on May 4th, that they had represented initially in the first week after the spill began, and which they had been representing in the subsequent time period after the May 4th hearing. What has happened, of course, is the Justice Department has now obtained contemporaneous documents with the May 4th hearing and subsequently, which shows that they knew that the number was much higher.
Let me point out that there was a very specific charge of obstruction of Congress. And Congressman Markey is talking about that particular obstruction of Congress and that information. But it went beyond that. And I sent a letter on June 14th to Tony Hayward, the Chief Executive Officer of BP, outlining many details that we were able to discern from the documents that were given to our committee of shortcuts that they took, of risks that they put in place for a possible blowout, things they should have known to do in a better way. And we set that out as well. Part of the criminality of BP's actions was not just misleading Congress, but in not doing the things that they could have done to avoid the blowout that killed 11 people. And that's why two of the individuals who were there on board that night, who were making a lot of the decisions at that moment, are being held for criminal liability personally. That case is not settled. What is being settled here is the payment of a settlement for the criminal liability of BP as a corporation, which includes this obstruction of Congress. The essential point is that they're being held accountable. We feel strongly when we do an investigation that people be required to tell us the truth. They had a lot of reasons, as Ed Markey pointed out, to lie. It was in their economic interest to lie. But it was not only misleading the Congress, it was misleading investors who would buy or sell the stock, who were being misled as to the consequences and the costs that were being imposed by the amount of the spill itself. They acted in an irresponsible, reckless way, and BP caused a tremendous disaster that cost the lives of 11 people, but probably the largest ecological disaster that we have seen in the United States caused by any one corporation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, yes, ma'am.
Sorry, how rare is it for someone to be charged with obstruction of Congress? How often has that happened in your experience?
Yeah, it happens on occasion. It's also rare to have a blowout that could have been prevented happening as it did in the Gulf. But you have to look at all of this in its entirety, and BP is being held accountable for what they did and didn't do, for the recklessness by which they operated, and then their attempt to cover it up in their testimony before the Congress of the United States in order to mislead investors and members of Congress and the American people.
So if we had known from the beginning that it was not 5,000 barrels, but 50,000 barrels or 60,000 barrels, that would have affected the amount of dispersants which was needed in order to break up the oil spill. It would have affected the amount of boom and skimmers that were needed in order to collect the oil. It would have affected how we viewed the top hat and other kill mechanisms which they had put in place initially in order to try to stop this spill. We would have understood a lot better the futility of the initial actions and substituted something that would have been much more dramatic. and likely to be successful. So it delayed the response, which was put in place in order to minimize the damage to the economy and the citizens of the Gulf of Mexico. And we're still paying that price. So it's unusual for it's very unusual for a case to be made against someone for lying to Congress. But when something as serious as this has occurred and the damage so great to the people of the Gulf of Mexico, it was absolutely imperative that criminal and civil action be taken against BP. Yes, sir.
Yeah, how satisfied are you with the size of this fine, given BP's size and the amount of money they make?
It is the largest fine in history. And it still isn't the completion of the case, because the civil fine could go as high as $21 billion. So I am very satisfied with the Justice Department action. And I'm also very happy that they are going to take this civil action all the way to court. And so I would hope that at the end this number would be so large in combination that it would serve as a significant deterrent to any other oil company ever again engaging in this level of reckless behavior.
General Holder left open the opportunity for potentially a settlement to be reached on the civil points before the February court date. Are you concerned that the federal government might reach a settlement that could perhaps undermine the Restore Act and some other things?
Well, I think he's used good judgment in trying to hold them accountable, and I'm sure he will use good judgment if he decides that the settlement's appropriate. And I have no criticism of him and how he's conducting his actions. He has not reached a settlement on those other matters, but he has on this part, which involves criminal actions. And I'm not going to second guess what he might do in the future. Right now, he's pursuing to trial, pursuing the matter to court.
Thank you all so much.
Markey, you have a second to talk about online privacy.
Can I just a couple minutes?
Okay, sure.
Can you comment on that? She's out. Can you send Mommy a smile?
Congressman Ed Markey and Henry Waxman talking about the Justice Department settlement today with BP over the 2010 Gulf oil spill, a $4.5 billion fine, and 2 criminal indictments. We covered earlier the news conference with Eric Holder, the Attorney General, and other Justice Department officials. You'll find that and this briefing that just wrapped up in our video library, plus